Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Cole, Marketing and Program Coordinator at Oregon Bio. Thank you for joining our mini BioPro Lunch and Learn. Today's topic is what manufacturers need to know about FDA's ASCA program. We'll call it ASCA. And leading today's Lunch and Learn will be our panelists, Leo Eisner and Eric Branca. In the left corner of your screen is Leo Eisner, the IEC 60601 guy, and Leo is the principal regulatory and compliance consultant of Eisner Safety Consultants. He is a world-renowned IEC 60601 under medical electrical equipment expert and is involved in the development of the IEC 60601 series, where he serves on multiple committees, including the Interpretation Committee. Leo has worked with the FDA to provide feedback on the ASCA Pilot Program, the Home Healthcare Guidance Document, standards development, and provided training on essential performance for the 60601 series of standards. Leo and his team have helped countless clients through the compliance and regulatory maze over his 23 years as a consultant and has over 36 years total experience. And our other panelist in the lower right corner of your screen is Dr. Eric Branca. Eric Branca is the Basic Safety and Essential Performance Test Lab Lead for the ASCA Pilot Program at the FDA. He is a biomedical engineer by trade, so positions in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health as a lead reviewer of neurological and physical medicine devices, and as a policy analyst on regulations, orders, and guidance documents. He has worked in standards in various capacities over the past 6 years and is currently a member of the U.S. National Committee of the IEC Council and the U.S. NC Conformity Assessment Policy Coordination Committee. Since joining the ASCA team in January, he has helped accredit 69 basic safety and essential performance test labs across the world in the ASCA Pilot Program. So hello again, I'm Jeff Cole. I'd like to thank today our sponsors for this program. That's Biotronic, CAI, Genentech Microsystems Engineering, Pharma, Skanska, Twist, and VWR. They're all platinum members with Oregon Bioscience. And of course, we thank all our members for making all our programs possible here. We appreciate your support. And now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. And we'll start with Eric. Take it away, Eric.
Let's get started. So hi, everybody. You just got my intro. I'm the test lab lead for basic safety and essential performance in the ASCA Pilot Program. So I'm going to talk about how this pilot can help streamline conformity assessment in device submissions. So I'm going to touch on a few things today. Start out by covering the basics of, what is ASCA? What does it stand for? Accreditation Scheme for Conformity Assessment, but ASCA is much easier to say. And then also what's included in the pilot, what standards can you use within the pilot, and then touch on how to prepare pre-market submissions with ASCA testing therein. So starting off, what is the ASCA Pilot? The ASCA Pilot's authorized under Section 514D of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It's always tough to get that. And it is part of the Medical Device User Fee, or the MDUFA 4 commitments of 2017. It's a voluntary program that we developed with input from experts across the medical device manufacturing and conformity assessment communities like Leo, and to capitalize on the existing use of voluntary consensus standards in device development and review. So we leverage already existing and well-established international conformity assessment infrastructures, and we combine that with the regulatory needs of the FDA. And we like to say this, putting standards to work on both individual and international levels. So now that you know what it is, why would you use it? And so the pilot was designed with the intention of increasing FDA's confidence in the test methods and the results contained within medical device submissions when they're using standards. So that enhanced confidence means that manufacturers should end up seeing fewer requests for additional information regarding test methods from an ASCA-accredited test lab. So this in turn helps lead to a review process that's more consistent, it's reliable, it's predictable, it's efficient. supports CDRH's commitment to least burdensome approaches to device review. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, this is to help the patients that we all serve to get access to safe, effective, high quality medical devices without unnecessary delay. So here's a picture of kind of the landscape of how communication worked within this using standards with the FDA. So it's pretty linear. FDA talks with industry when we get a pre-market submission. We review the test reports that industry gets from contracts with testing labs. And then the accreditation bodies, which you may or may not be aware of, but accreditation bodies accredit the testing labs to certain standards. And in particular, we'll talk about in here is ISO IEC 17025. And so this is kind of the landscape outside of ASCA. Now, what has happened with the ASCA pilot is we've created new lines of communication between the FDA and the ASCA accredited testing labs and the recognized accreditation bodies. So this will help us improve our understanding of how these entities operate, which, we don't know everything. We like to know how people do these things, how test labs work, how accreditation bodies work. And also, so we can convey our expectations for effective participation in the ASCA Pilot Program, which ultimately it boils down to, we want confidence in what these organizations are doing. So in terms of how test plans are created, how they're tested, the methods used. So we don't have questions later. You see this top communication line when we're going back and forth on a pre-market submission. So we have less questions for you about something that should be straightforward, a standard. So this is an ongoing rapport with the test labs and accreditation bodies. And we want to make sure we're just continually on the same page. So we're growing as a program, we're still a pilot, but it is ultimately we will improve and we will see how this program works. And to that point, how does it work? So first, FDA grants ASCA recognition to the qualified accreditation bodies who meet the pilot specifications. Now, I'll say specifications, they're laid out in our guidance documents, and I'll touch on those in a moment. From there, the accreditation bodies then accredit test labs to ISO IEC 17025 and the additional specifications that are laid out in our guidance documents. The test labs then come to us, the ASCA program, requesting ASCA accreditation, and both independent and in-house test labs may participate. And really the nuts and bolts of this process, if you're interested, since it's the test lab side, you can take a look at it in our program guidance document. And then once accredited, the test lab's information, including their scope of accreditation, and we will touch on this later, particularly Leo, is posted on FDA's website. So then device manufacturers, before I go into this, I'm going to say you a lot, and I'm going to be lumping in manufacturers into the you. I'm just assuming that's my audience in general. But so device manufacturers can then go to that website, find a test lab that has the standards they want to use in their scope of ASCA accreditation. You contact that lab, develop a test plan with the lab, and then once that's developed, you can that lab then takes your device, does the testing. If all's well, you just get the test report, including an ASCA Summary Test Report from that test lab. Then the last step is you compile all your information for FDA like you normally would in terms of what pathways you pursue for specific devices. And then that includes the ASCA Summary Test Report and also a declaration of conformity. And importantly, and I'll probably say this way too many times in this presentation, but the ASCA Summary Test Report is provided to the FDA as is. So what you get from the test lab should be provided directly to FDA as is. And then we do our review like we normally would, hopefully quicker. So I've mentioned the guidance documents a few times now. So I want to touch on them a little bit more. There are three. So the first one is our overarching program guidance, which touches on basically general information, specific procedures within the program. And then in addition to that, we have two standard specific guidance documents, which cover the families which are included in the pilot program, which are biocompatibility and basic safety and essential performance. So starting with biocompatibility here, the list of standards that are included in the pilot are here on the left. And then on the right, you'll see the individual test methods that are included in the pilot program. There are 9 biocompatibility test methods and 8 standards included in the ASCA pilot. So here you'll see a button. It looks like a button, the View ASCA Pilot Standards link there. It should be clickable. I think you all have access to it. If you click on that, it will take you to our recognized consensus standards database, specifically to a page that just has the ASCA pilot standards included, including all of the versions, the additions, any amendments. All of that will be highlighted in there, and you can take a look at specifically what's included. And then moving forward again, the basic safety and the central performance family. There are 2 families in this group of standards. The ANSI/AAMI 60601-1 family, which includes a lot of the FDA recognized collateral and particular standards in the IEC ISO 60601 and 80601 family. And then also IEC 61010-1. And at present, this is the only standard in this particular family that's currently included in the ASCA pilot. So again, the same button, you can take a look at that by clicking through and you'll see exactly what's included. I know these slides say you can check our guidance, and while there is a really generic list in our guidance documents, they're already a little bit out of date. So I encourage you to check out the recognized consensus standards database over looking in our guidance documents. So now that I've touched there, I want to go over how to prepare a pre-market submission with ASCA testing included. So the ASCA aspects of a pre-market submission are pretty straightforward, and there's 5 basic steps that go into it. So you choose the standards you want to use, you develop a test plan with your ASCA-accredited test lab, you plan out your submission elements, you get all the documentation from the test lab, and then finally you prep your submission, send it to us. I'll go into each of these with a little more detail. So step 1, you identify the standard or the standards that you want to use. The important thing about this step is that you should first check the list of standards included in the ASCA pilot, as I've mentioned in the previous slides. So going to the consensus standards database, checking out what's included, and then also to review the supplementary information sheet for each of the standards of interest to you. Those will include more information like the extent of FDA recognition, which can have additional information or provide additional context for what the FDA expects when utilizing the standard. And then a quick, but again, important reminder, the manufacturer maintains the responsibility for the choice of standards and the test methods and the appropriate use and application of them in support of their device submission.
Eric?
Sure.
This is Leo. Just want to point out on the SIS pages.
Got a question. Oh, yeah.
This is Leo.
Yeah, hey, Leo.
Just on the SIS page, there's also a line on that page that identifies that those are ASCA standards, right?
Yeah, so there is
sort of describe that a little more.
Sure, yeah. In the supplementary information sheet, it's a wordy name, is like a sub-page for each standard, and it'll have the designation number. FDA has their own designation number for each standard, recognition number. And then they have basically what's the name of the standard, what version is it included in the ASCA pilot? And it'll say yes. So if you go to our base database web page, there's actually a checkbox if you go to search. And if you don't fill in any information into what standards you're looking for and just tick that checkbox, you can see all of the standards that are included in the program. So and then I see there is one question. I can go ahead and answer it now. How different is the effort in comparison to the ICEE CB scheme? There are similarities with respect to comparing to the CB scheme, but there are a lot of differences in terms of what is expected from test labs and how they operate, and the specifications in our guidance document. It doesn't really touch on how it differs from the CB scheme, but if you're familiar with the CB scheme, you'll read what is expected in terms of the ASCA Pilot Program, and there are a lot of key features that there are little things that are different. And we've learned this through talking with the ASCA-accredited test labs who are clarifying how to do certain procedures and how to proceed with certain avenues and how that jives with the CB scheme. So we've learned about more differences than we even knew about before. So there are key differences, but I think it'll be a really long conversation if I get into a lot of them, but I'll go ahead and proceed. So the second step is finding an ASCA accredited test lab, and Leo's going to help with this a little bit later as well from the list posted on our website. And then we really want you to work together with the lab to develop and agree on a plan. So remember that even though the manufacturer is ultimately responsible for test plans, that hasn't changed with the ASCA program. It's the same as before. We want the process to be collaborative. So we want manufacturers to leverage the engineering expertise, the standards expertise of the ASCA accredited test labs to develop an appropriate test plan based on a review of the device, the risk management file, the documentation, intended use, essential performance, everything that goes into a test plan. We want you to work with them to develop a comprehensive plan that will be appropriate for the specific device. And then as you develop the plan, also consider that you take a look at relevant FDA guidance documents and not just the ASCA program guidances. That will ensure the testing you'll be doing will be in line with any other policy from FDA on specific devices. In case there's a guidance document specific to your device, there may be additional context in those guidances. And in addition to that, the recognized consensus standards need to be, these standards need to be FDA recognized, and anything that's in the ASCA Pilot Program will be recognized. So as long as you're using those versions of the standards, that's fine. But double check that before you go ahead in the database I mentioned. And then also make sure the testing you want to perform is within the test lab scope of ASCA accreditation. So next step is to plan out the submission elements. So what goes into it that's new with respect to ASCA elements. So you'll need three things: a cover letter, a declaration of conformity, and then the ASCA Summary Test Report. And I'm going to go into each one in a little more detail. So the cover letter, some of you are probably familiar with Form 3514, which is also called the submission cover sheet. So that form contains a lot of the same information as like a cover letter would, where it can typically be used instead of a cover letter that's written out. However, with all the submissions that are being received in electronic format, such as a USB, we're asking that a cover letter be provided to identify what the submission is and what center it belongs to. That way, when we get it, we route it to the right place so we don't lose time that way. And we also flag it that it has ASCA information in that submission. And so how do we do that? We're asking that when preparing a pre-market submission, in the cover letter, you include a few additional pieces of information stating that the cover letter, stating that it contains the ASCA Summary Test Report, information about where the test lab is, its ID number, and so information about the lab, and then what standards you're using in support of your pre-market submission that are included in the ASCA program. So then the declaration of conformity, many of you may be familiar with this as it was something that existed pre-ASCA. So the declaration of conformity is the manufacturer's responsibility. You'll be filling this out, providing additional context for what testing was performed. And so for submissions that do use ASCA accredited testing lab, the declaration of conformity should reflect and should include the information about the test lab's status, ASCA accreditation status at the time of testing, just to make sure that they were accredited at the time testing was performed. So to this point, in a few years ago, we published the appropriate use of voluntary consensus standards in pre-market submissions for medical devices. That's a guidance document. to lay out what a declaration of conformity should contain. So I really encourage you to check that out. But also in ASCA, we expanded on that guidance and included an example of what's expected from a declaration of conformity with respect to ASCA testing. And that is in the standard-specific ASCA guidance documents in the annexes. And then the last part, the ASCA Summary Test Report. So this document's created by the test lab and given straight to the manufacturer. And to go in a little more detail here, so the ASCA Summary Test Report were created in response to feedback we received to our draft guidance documents for this program. And they're generally expected to be the only supporting documentation you need when they accompany a declaration of conformity, which means you don't need to submit the full test report anymore, which can be scrutinized by our review staff, and it often is. So the summary test reports that you can find examples in our device-specific guidance documents. And there are 9 of them, 1 for each test method, I believe, for biocompatibility, and just 1 for the basic safety and essential performance. And I think Leo is going to walk through a few elements of that are in that one later in his presentation. So we'll get a better look at that in a few minutes. So to offer a quick example of why this benefits everybody is a typical full test report for 60601-1, just the base standards, say. It can often be somewhere like 100 pages, a PDF that's 100 pages long. So that should be distilled down with an ASCA summary test report to about 10 or so pages, thereabouts. So I'm a former reviewer. I used to review submissions. This will be a big time savings. Like if I'm putting on my reviewer hat, instead of flipping through page after page of P's, F's, and NA's, not applicables, passing and failing, it'll be distilled into a digestible format, the ASCA summary test report. So for your average lead reviewer, who's often overworked, overloaded with reviews, depending on the review office, they're gonna look at this summary test report and get everything they need to know in a much more digestible format than we ever received with full test reports. So there's the benefit offered by a summarized test report. So then going back to the steps for preparing your pre-market submission, the test lab takes the test plan, they're ready to go, they do the testing, they complete the testing, they finish their reports, assuming everything was great, they send it to you, and that's that. Then you can start to prepare your pre-market submission. So what goes into that? You'll assemble the following: a cover letter with the ASCA specific information that we mentioned, the declaration of conformity that you draft up, and and then lastly, the summary test report. And please, those are provided as is. All other submission requirements are also important to provide in the identified pre-market pathway. So whatever you'd normally provide in a 510K, PMA, De Novo, or IDE, all of that also needs to be provided. So quick summary, and I'll touch on that question in a moment or later. Thanks. Basically, we think the ASCA program, it can offer some pretty significant advantages for both manufacturers and the FDA. So it's designed to increase consistency and predictability in the FDA's approach to assessing conformance. And that should reduce regulatory burden, streamlining conformity assessment. And most importantly, maybe, it ensures patients get access to safe, effective devices without unnecessary delay, and allows FDA review staff to focus on things that matter. Like if there's clinical testing, we can really focus in on that. And then lastly, again, another summary, the 5 steps to prep submission with ASCA testing: identify your standards, agree on a test plan with your identified ASCA-accredited test lab, plan your submission elements, get the results, the ASCA summary test reports, and then prepare your FDA submission, sending in the ASCA specific elements, in addition to the normal elements, information required to meet the statutory requirements for the submission pathway you're pursuing. So normally I would start with questions, but there are a few slides at the end here that has links, information that you can use. If you have any follow-up questions that we don't answer in this, and we will get to the one that was in the chat eventually, Feel free to email me and we'll get to that. But I think, Leo, we're coming up with you now.
First, I'm going to unmute, then I'm going to switch to screen share. Once I get my, oops, maybe I did that wrong. Let me move this up to screen share. Oops, and of course I started in the wrong slide. Sorry about that. Let's start over. Okay, now I'm ready to, am I sharing?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to skip over this screen, this slide, because it's just an intro. This is my company. Everyone can ask me later about that. I'm not going to mark it today. As Jeff introduced me, I'm the IEC 601 guy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the standard throughout. So for those that want to learn a little more about it, there's a couple live links here. You can learn more about the standard. And also Jeff mentioned 15223-1, which is the standard for marking, labeling information for all medical device companies. And that just got published July 6th. So there was a webinar I just did that was really popular. So there's a good webinar, good information on it, and I'm going to go on. So this standard that just got published last summer, edition 3.2 of IEC 60601-1, I was heavily involved, multiple committees, and that's what we're going to touch on throughout the rest of the presentation, linked with the ASCA program, which I was on the expert panel on essential performance, which one of the key things I'm really thrilled about within the program is that FDA now gets to communicate directly with the test labs. And that's really important to me because, as Eric talked about in one of his slides, before the program, they didn't have a link between the FDA and the test labs. And so they couldn't communicate that, how to clarify that essential performance was really important, that the FDA would look at the test reports, and test labs that didn't understand essential performance, manufacturer would go to the test lab and the test lab would say, do you have essential performance? Manufacturers say, what's essential performance? And the manufacturer would say, I don't know. I guess I have no essential performance. Test lab would go, okay, no essential performance, check. Test report would go into the manufacturer, would send in the test report to FDA. FDA would look at it and go, where's your essential performance analysis per clause 4.3 of 60601-1? And then they'd get additional information requests. And they'd be, so far behind the ball that maybe their product wouldn't get to market. And they'd come crying to me as a consultant saying, what do I need to do? Well, you have to end up figuring out what is your essential performance, which could be a redesign of your product, or at a minimum, figuring out what your essential performance is and retesting. It gets expensive. So having that communication up front and figuring out things up front in testing instead of waiting to last minute and finding out bad news is so much better. So having that link and the communication up front is such a win-win all the way around. I think this program's going to benefit FDA in the review process, the manufacturer, the test labs, everyone. And also the test labs learning about the guidance documents that they didn't know about. I think that's a good thing too. And for the manufacturer as well. And the rest of this, Eric discussed, so I'm not going to get into anymore. And as Eric mentioned, there's 69 basic safety and essential performance test labs, And there is one biocompatibility test lab that got accredited recently, which was July 23rd, and that's NAMSA. So these are live links that are in my presentation, so you can click on them and get more information about them. So when the program kicked off, I think it was April, and there were either 43 or 48 labs. And since then, it's increased. In May, there were 53, and now there's 70 labs. So that's all good news that the program's steadily increasing. The other good thing, and Eric alluded to that, is you can have your own in-house test lab. So there's 3 manufacturers currently, 3M, Cook Medical, and Philips. And there's a link here that you can get further information about internal test labs if you want to pursue that yourself. And Eric and I were having conversations over the last couple of weeks putting this program together for you guys. And I fell on this link a couple of weeks ago and I said, Eric, you really need to put this in your presentation because it makes it so much more obvious where to find that list of ASCA pilot standards. So that's where that came from, because I had him added into his presentation. But what are the important issues to consider when you pick an ASCA test lab? And there's a couple key questions. So these questions apply to both the biocompatibility list and also the basic safety and essential performance list. But this first red bullet is targeted, the example is targeted more towards the basic safety and essential performance list because I'm skewed towards the 601 series of standards since that's my expertise. So not all standards in the 601 series of standards are in the ASCA program because they're not all recognized consensus standards. So like 80601-2-49, the IEC standard, or IEC ISO, if you want to get technical, because that's the multifunction patient monitor standard, and that's not a recognized consensus standard. So any standard that's not a recognized consensus standard cannot be an ASCA standard. And Eric said that directly. So one thing to be clear is 80601 standards are part of the 601 series because they are, all that means is they were jointly developed between IEC and ISO. So another thing is there are some new standards that have been added. I should say there is one new standard, and it happens to be 80601-2-58, which is lens removal and vitrectomy equipment. Excuse me for a second. Which happens to be the standard I'm the convener of. I happen to get news from the head of the Standards and Conformity Assessment Program, which happens to be Eric's boss and someone I communicate with a lot. And he sent me a note a couple months ago when it happened. And so I happened to go on to the recognized consensus standards database to check it out and see all the details on the SIS page. And I happened to realize that the standard ended up in the ASCA Pilot Program. And I was happily surprised about that. So when I was preparing for the presentation in the last week or so, I also looked and I couldn't find any labs that are accredited to this standard. So anything that gets added in new, the test labs may or may not add that standard in. So you need to check if any new standards get added in that apply to you that you're considering. You may need to ask the lab to ask them to add it to the accreditation if that applies to you. So things to consider. So do the labs have multiple locations? And there are quite a few labs on the list now Underwriters Labs, Intertech, TUV Sood, other labs. There's quite a few labs that have multiple locations. Do all those locations that have multiple labs, do they have the same standards list? And the answer is no, not all of them do. And I'm going to show you on the next slide. Do you want to test locally? And in many cases, that may be the case, especially for EMC testing or EM disturbances, depending on what you want to call it. It's the same thing, tomato, tomato. And the reason is for essential performance testing and pass-fail criteria, you will have an engineer or a technician or someone monitoring that as the manufacturer typically. And like Eric said, I'm using as the manufacturer, but there may be some test labs that are in this meeting too, because I suggested that test labs may be interested in this as well when we're putting this together. What is the lab's experience and expertise and experience? That is not something that's in the list of test labs that the accreditors are accrediting to. So this is something as the manufacturer that needs to, you are going to have to do your own due diligence that's separate from the accreditation information or from FDA's information per se. So how do you determine and pick a lab? Well, there's a list on the FDA's accredited testing lab website. So there's, within the filters, there's two categories, which are the two guidances that are specific, the biocompatibility one and the basic safety and essential performance. There's all 50 states in the search, and there's also the countries, which some of the countries would be China, Canada, US, Spain, Germany. I think there's Brazil, and I know there's other countries. There's a free field search, so you can put in the lab, you can put in a standard, you can put in other terminology. What else to look out for in the search results? Exclusions. And I'll get into this in the example in a minute. Asterisk is part of the exclusion, and hopefully in the future, that will get updated to be more detailed than the exclusion, because you'll see it next to the standard, and then at the very bottom, it'll basically say contact the lab. And I have a problem with that, because if you have 5 labs that you have that with, it's going to be a lot of contacting the lab to get the information, and that's just going to take a lot of time away from being able to figure things out. So let's go to, come on, a couple quick examples, if I can get there. So I'm going to go up to the top of a web page here. So this is the web link for the accredited testing labs. And here you will see there's 70 entries total. And this is F2 is one of the labs. And I'm not making any opinions or recommendations. These are just searches I've done to give examples how to go through the database a little bit and understand it a little bit. So F2 has 2 labs, and they're both under basic safety, essential performance. Again, that's my forte. I'm not going to show you. The biocompatibility has one, which is NAMSA. So this lab happens to be all basics, all safety standards. And the first standard is how the recognition database shows the IEC 60601-1 standard. It's the US national version of the standard, and that's how FDA recognizes the standard. And the second one, excuse me, is the home healthcare standard 1-11, which is the collateral standard. I guess also I forget that for the 1-11, they also recognize the IEC version, but the general standard, they only recognize the AAMI version of it. And that's just how FDA does it. Again, as Eric mentioned, for 61010-1, they only recognize the laboratory standard. They do not recognize the IVD standard, the 61010-2-101. So if they did, this lab, like several other labs, probably would have had that in their accreditation. The EMC standard 60601-1-2 is not on this list. This lab probably wouldn't have it because it looks like they only do safety standards. But this lab in Ohio for F2 does have it. And this is an oddity. I haven't seen it with any of the other labs, but there may be other labs. Their accreditor specifically noted that for these particular standards here, the -2- whatevers, it says only including sections 201.17 and 202. This is stating basically this particular standard, which is a basic safety and essential performance standard, can only be tested for EMC, because these clauses are EMC clauses of the standard, where this standard 601-2-19, you can do the full basic safety and essential performance, including the EMC side of it. So one question Eric and I discussed the last couple of days is other accreditations for other labs may have 60601-2-18, but not this exclusion. So sort of like what this is noted here with 219. And that lab may not have EMC in its accreditation, or it may not have EMC equipment, and it still may be accredited this way. So you may need to do an ASCA report for all the safety side of testing and still have a separate EMC report separately. I'm going to show you real quick Intertech. So remember I mentioned the asterisk. So I'm not going to go through the list of standards, but the asterisk, all that means is contact the test lab for more information and talks about the accreditation body. Now, this Intertech test lab, its whole accreditation is just EMC 60601-1-2. But this Intertech lab has a ton of, so each location may have a very different skew of standards. So you need to be very specific to look at the location. That's the basic point of what I wanted to show. That. So I'm going to hide this and go on. And I know we're running out of time, so I want to keep things moving. I want to move that down so it's out of my hair. Okay, and I went through this. The one thing I just want to highlight really quick, Eric went through all these steps. So two real quick points is that I'm really happy to see that the test labs are allowed to work with the manufacturers, especially the small manufacturers, to sort of highlight the standards and work with them on, work with the manufacturers on the test plan. I'm not going to mention another point there. And then on the summary test report, as Eric said, you as the manufacturer are not allowed to modify the summary test report. Just remember, you need to submit it in your submission packet, but don't modify it. And I'm going to talk more about the summary test report in a second. So One thing is, just because you're not allowed to modify the summary test report, you want to really review it closely and make sure these elements, and I'm going to point to them in the next couple of slides and talk about a little bit very briefly, because I know we're running out of time, that you want to look at them closely and review them closely. And you may need to work with the test lab. So the more you can work up front with them and figure out your test plan well up front, the better off you're going to be. Because if you get information in the summary test report that looks weird or doesn't make sense, that you don't want to submit it to the FDA because there's problems, you may end up that you need to retest. And that's not what you want to have, right? You'd rather figure it out up front than be at this point that you have to retest. So this is right out of the guidance document. And one of the key things is that the format is not set in stone. And the guidance says that the test labs don't have to give it to you exactly in this format. This is just a quote guidance. The important things for you is, as a manufacturer, is to read closely what it says, especially in these box notes, and to read the footnotes that are attached to all this information, because it tells you really well what the FDA is trying to tell you and what they're thinking. And if you don't understand it, excuse me for a sec, I would contact the FDA, either directly if you have a good contact through a reviewer, or maybe through DICE or through a pre-sub. And also you have Eric's contact info now too. So go hit him up. He's a great resource and he'll explain things. He's really good. He's very helpful. I really like working with Eric a lot. So essential performance, I beg you to get essential performance right from the get-go. If you don't, you're going to suffer. These two are very straightforward, so I'm not going to touch on it. Modification test method and acceptance criteria, you want to make sure that makes sense, that if there's any modifications during testing, you got to review your test reports, what comes back from the test lab. You got to review what was tested and make sure that connects to this summary report too. This point here, the additional testing, this note is critical. This is based on your risk management file. If you identify a point that there's a, excuse me for a second, I just lost my thought. If there's a hazardous situation that's not specifically addressed in the standard, whichever standard within the 601 series specifically in this case, that isn't addressed in the standard itself. And remember, you're handing FDA your risk management file. They will pick up on that and they will ask, it should be identified here. If it's not identified here, they're going to question that. And this last point may be hidden, so I'm going to move this up. Device configurations and modes of operation. These should match exactly what your device was tested, including your essential performance configurations and modes of operation. So that you want to make sure is tied all together well. This one's an oddball how it's written, so you're going to want to read this closely, and it ties a lot with EMC testing, but it also could be with single fault testing. Observations, degradations were found but deemed acceptable based on the pass-fail criteria identified by the device manufacturer. So that's pretty important. This is modifications of articles during testing. And this is this could be a red flag area for the FDA, concerns identified. And these were communicated to the device manufacturer. So you got to be concerned about that one. And that really is the end of my presentation. And if you have questions, you can always contact me as well. So I think we should go to questions now.
Yes, everyone, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A portion. We'll also check the chat for any of your questions. I actually have a question myself, I guess, for Eric. You mentioned that that you have basically a summary report. The lab is preparing, the accredited lab is preparing a summarized report versus the longer the report. You used to mention that you have to go through 100 pages, right? Now you got it down to 10 pages. So by doing that, is the lab actually also scope of testing smaller? Is it the same scope of testing, but what is being reported less? And if what's being reported less in that summary is not the full version, would you ever have a scenario where you would start to ask for the full version or have questions on that?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point. So the scope of testing shouldn't change. They're doing everything they used to do, plus the ASCA Summary Test Report. So they'll still give manufacturers full test reports, which will be hundreds of pages, depending on how many standards are evaluated. And that's fine for their records. They're paying for it after all. What we will end up receiving are these kind of truncated versions with what Leo was kind of highlighting there. And the situations where we may develop questions would typically be related to specifically that concern section, where Leo kind of highlighted this will be a red flag for us. It would be a red flag for us, but really manufacturers shouldn't be surprised by anything that ends up in that box. Usually it'll be, the test lab has communicated concerns with the plan, the testing results, or kind of modifications that a manufacturer is making to try and pass, as opposed to doing it the correct way. So if we see something in that box, the manufacturer should know about it, and if they feel comfortable submitting that to us, then we're probably going to have follow-up questions, which may result in the request of the big test report. And specifically in the biocompatibility space, if you look in their standard specific guidance, their example test reports do have kind of a pathway for when we need more information. If it's relatively straightforward, they're ticking all the boxes and it's fine. So there are situations where it may arise that we need more information, but ideally all the work we've done front loading our questions for the labs and reviewing their information and getting them accredited should avoid a lot of that downstream when we get your application, your submission. With ASCA testing, we should hopefully have less questions or no questions, preferable. I think that answered it.
Cool. This would be for either of you. How much time could I potentially save on my device's review by using an ASCA accredited test lab?
I mean, I can take this one real quick. We're not really promising that you're going to have less time. We're not altering review timelines. We're part of MDUFA 4, but we didn't really change any of the goals. So what we're hoping to do is streamline the conformity assessment aspects of these submissions. So we're hoping that due to the increased confidence we have in the labs, their methods and the results, we're going to have to review less, and we're going to be confident in what we do receive. So we'll have less questions for you, less questions for the lab, preferably none of either. And in terms of, why doesn't that result in a specific goal? At this point, there's a lot of variables that go into something like total time to decision, which I know is something industry is invested in and FDA is invested in, obviously, through MDUFA agreements. But it's really hard to see how this program could help drive down those deadlines due to all these other conflicting factors. However, we're hoping to see some time savings once we start getting a lot of data for how the program is performing.
And we do have a question that came through our Q&A. I see that, Leo, you're starting to answer that. Do you want to answer that on screen?
Yes, sure. I'll try my best, then Eric can correct me. How's that? So yes, the test lab does need to provide full test data and do full testing, raw data, no matter what, because the summary test report is not full test data. So they do. So the question was, does this mean the test lab needs to provide full detailed report, including raw data, not just the worst case observed, to the manufacturer in case a feedback comes from the FDA? It's not because it's in case the feedback comes from the FDA. The manufacturer is paying for the testing of the product, and the manufacturer needs records of the testing for their quality system at a minimum, for one thing. And also, when the FDA comes in and audits them, also, they will need the records there, as well as for the manufacturer's own quality system.
Yep.
So I'm getting the impression here, and correct me if
So
I'm wrong.
the summary test report doesn't have any quote data in the same sense. Correct, Eric?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's still test labs still doing what they always did in terms of doing all of the testing, documenting everything in their records, and also what they typically provide to manufacturers, which would be the full test report they would normally get in case there are follow-up questions or feedback from FDA. And
you need it for your design history file, for your technical file, for your for any design history file, whatever you want to call it, depending on what regulatory submission path you're in.
Yeah. I see there's another question.
The other questions looks like it's FDA related. So
yeah,
Eric?
happy to take that. So the question is, how does FDA ensure competency of the test labs, and that some accreditation bodies only review 17025 and not competency to specific standards? So the ASCA program does also recognize the accreditation bodies. So we do review the accreditation bodies that are included in the program, and audit in the future and have conversations with them in terms of what's expected. And a lot of that is laid out in the program specifications. So in addition to 17025, our guidance documents laid out additional specifications, basically additional information that we want from test labs participating in the program. And there has been a lot of training for the accreditation bodies, and training for the test labs as well, in terms of what the expectations are for effective participation in the program, and to ensure they have the competency to do specifically what they're accredited to do. So, yeah.
So
we're pretty much, I'm sorry, go ahead, Leo, if you had something to add quickly.
Well, the question about the competency within the specific standards, is it in general the standards list, or is it a specific standard? Competency of a specific standard, or is it more broadly, Eric?
For in terms of what they're competent to perform during the specifications of 17025. So there aren't
not 17025, but
the individual standards.
Yeah.
So the requirements for the test labs, it doesn't go into each individual standard in terms of the competencies, but if the test lab's not equipped to, I mean, a lot of these are equipment limited for a lot of the tests that'll be performed in particulars and some of the collaterals. And if they're not equipped or competent to do one thing or the other, then we would expect our accreditation body to not accredit them to a specific standard in their scope of accreditation. So you'll see, if you ever go to the accreditation bodies, and to Leo's kind of bugaboo. I know we're over, but correcting our website or giving more information. If you go to the Accrediting Bodies website, you can look at the specific scope, and it does include more information. And it is a separate little section on each scope of accreditation that's just for ASCA, which includes a lot of the exclusions and other stuff. So sorry, I know we're over time.
No, that's fine. I mean, we can hang on a couple moments. You know, I see one of the overarching points is to save time, to save money. It looks like a lot of the same, you know, the test scope might not be reduced, but the process of having accredited labs, of the FDA being able to have this pilot structure, is that going to condense the timeline on approvals significantly?
Yeah, I mean, it's related to another question. I mean, obviously we hope so. I mean, we're trying to meet some pretty aggressive MDUFA goals, just, you know, not ASCA, but just the FDA or CDRH in general. So we're trying to make sure we hit the goals we need to hit to make sure submissions get out the door, approved, cleared, whatever it is, on time and expeditiously as is needed. So we can't really guarantee it'll drive down the time, but this is a huge chunk of a review for a lot of submission types, 510Ks in particular. So it'll drive down the time it takes to actually review things like that. So it will help streamline that aspect of the review, and you'll get a happier reviewer, I'm hoping, because of it. I certainly would be.
Well, that's just terrific. I want to thank both of you for joining us today and talking about this. And I do see one question if the slides will be available, and we can share those as an email out to our virtual attendees today. So we want to thank everyone for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you on our next Lunch and Learn at Oregon Bio. And until next time, I'm wishing you all a very good day. Thank you.